There's a phase, and I want to be honest with you right at the start of this episode, that not every narcissist ever reaches. But when it does happen, the people closest to them are usually the first to sense that something has shifted into territory they've never seen before, even after years of dealing with difficult, sometimes cruel behavior. This isn't the ordinary cycle of idealization and devaluation we've discussed in previous episodes. This is something further along, something darker. Something that shows up in a fairly specific, recognizable set of signs once you know what to look for. Today, I want to walk you through 3 of the most telling signs that someone with narcissistic patterns has entered this darker phase, why this phase tends to emerge under specific conditions rather than randomly, and importantly, what it means for your own safety and decision-making if you recognize these signs in someone currently in your life. Let's get into it. Before we get into the specific signs, I want to explain briefly why this darker phase happens at all, because understanding the mechanism helps make the signs themselves much easier to recognize accurately, rather than mistaking ordinary narcissistic behavior for something that hasn't actually developed into this more severe territory yet. Everything we've discussed in previous episodes about narcissistic patterns generally assumes a kind of functioning equilibrium. The narcissist maintains sufficient supply, sufficient admiration, sufficient control over the people and narratives around them to keep their fragile internal structure propped up without ever needing to escalate into the more extreme territory we're discussing today. The darker phase tends to emerge specifically when that equilibrium collapses significantly, often triggered by some combination of major, simultaneous losses. A significant relationship ending on terms they couldn't control, a public reputational blow they couldn't successfully manage or reframe, a major life setback that removed multiple sources of validation at once. When the usual functioning strategies stop working reliably, some narcissists, though certainly not all, escalate into more extreme, more dangerous versions of the same underlying patterns. And this is the specific phase we're discussing today. Let's start with a story. A woman named Renata had been divorced from her husband, Marek, for almost a year when she began noticing something had changed in his behavior, something distinctly different from the difficult controlling patterns she'd experienced throughout their marriage. The divorce itself had been contentious, and Marek had lost more than he'd expected. Custody arrangements hadn't gone the way he'd anticipated. His business had suffered from the reputational fallout of some of his behavior becoming known within their shared social and professional circles, and a new relationship he'd rushed into almost immediately after the separation had already ended, badly, within a few months. By the time Renata started noticing the shift we're discussing today, Marek had experienced, within a relatively compressed period, nearly every category of loss that research on this darker phase identifies as a common trigger. The first sign, and this is the one that Renata noticed earliest, is escalating disregard for consequences that would previously have mattered enormously to someone this image-conscious. Throughout their marriage, Marek had been almost obsessively careful about his public reputation, his professional standing, the way he was perceived by mutual friends and colleagues. This careful image management had actually functioned in a strange way as a kind of natural limiter on how far his more controlling or manipulative behaviors would typically go, because he genuinely cared what people thought of him, and certain behaviors simply carried too much reputational risk to be worth attempting. During the darker phase, this limiter often disappears, sometimes rapidly, and behavior that would previously have been calculated and carefully managed becomes noticeably more reckless, more visible, less concerned with how it might be perceived by others. For Renata, this showed up in a specific, alarming way. Marek began making comments to their mutual friends, and even to their children, that were far more openly hostile and unfiltered than anything she'd witnessed during their marriage, when his cruelty had almost always been delivered privately, carefully, in ways that could be denied or reframed if ever challenged publicly. This shift matters enormously for understanding what's happening, because it reveals that the specific mechanism holding the more severe behavior in check, the concern for external perception and consequence, has genuinely weakened or collapsed, which tends to correlate with increasingly unpredictable and sometimes more dangerous behavior overall, precisely because a person who no longer feels constrained by consequences becomes, by definition, harder to predict and harder to manage using the same social or interpersonal tools that might have worked previously. I want to pause here and say something important because this specific sign carries real safety implications that I don't want to understate or rush past. If you notice this pattern, someone whose careful, calculated image management has suddenly, noticeably deteriorated into more open hostility, more public volatility, less apparent concern for how their behavior is perceived or what consequences it might carry. This is genuinely a moment to take seriously from a safety perspective, not just a psychological curiosity to analyze intellectually. Reduced concern for consequences in someone with narcissistic patterns can, in some cases, correlate with increased risk of harassment, stalking behavior, or other genuinely dangerous escalations. And if you're navigating a situation where you recognize this specific shift, it's worth taking concrete, practical safety precautions rather than simply trying to understand the psychology from a safe intellectual distance. Let's talk about the second sign, which is distinct but often emerges alongside the first. Increasingly fragmented, contradictory self-narrative that starts to break down even under mild scrutiny. We discussed in an earlier episode how narcissists often maintain fragmented, sometimes contradictory versions of their own history across different relationships and audiences, versions that can coexist for years without colliding as long as those different audiences never compare notes. During the darker phase, something different happens. The narrative fragmentation often accelerates dramatically, sometimes to the point where a single conversation contains internally contradictory claims that would have been carefully avoided during a more functioning period. This isn't simply more lying. It's a sign that the underlying capacity for maintaining a coherent, managed self-presentation, something that requires real, ongoing cognitive effort, has genuinely begun to deteriorate under the weight of accumulated losses and the resulting psychological strain. Renata noticed this specifically during a co-parenting mediation session, where Marek, within the span of a single conversation, described their marriage's ending in two completely contradictory ways. First claiming she had abandoned the relationship without warning, then, minutes later, describing an elaborate, detailed account of trying desperately to save a relationship he'd apparently known for over a year was already effectively over. These weren't strategic, deliberate contradictions designed to confuse or manipulate. The mediator, an experienced professional, noted afterward that they appeared to be genuine confusion, an inability to maintain a single, coherent narrative even within a single sitting, which was notably different from the controlled, consistent, if ultimately dishonest narratives Marek had maintained throughout their marriage and the initial stages of their divorce. This fragmentation matters because it reveals something important about the underlying psychological state driving the darker phase. The significant compounding losses have begun to genuinely overwhelm the cognitive and emotional resources required to maintain the careful narrative management that previously kept the more functioning version of narcissistic behavior operational. This isn't necessarily a sign of impending positive change or breakthrough, and I want to be careful not to frame it that way, because it can just as easily precede further escalation as it can precede any kind of genuine reckoning. What it does reveal, reliably, is that whatever internal structure was previously managing this person's behavior with at least some consistency has begun to genuinely destabilize. And destabilized systems, in psychology as much as in physical systems, tend to become less predictable, not more, as they break down further. Let's move into the third sign, which I think is genuinely the most important one to understand clearly, because it has the most direct implications for how you should think about your own safety and boundaries if you're navigating a situation involving someone in this specific phase, escalating attempts to involve third parties in increasingly extreme or inappropriate ways. During a more functioning period, a narcissist's efforts to recruit witnesses or manage narrative through third parties, which we discussed in earlier episodes, tend to remain within socially recognizable bounds, mentioning concerns to mutual friends, subtly influencing family opinion, the kinds of behaviors that, while manipulative, don't cross into genuinely alarming territory. During the darker phase, these attempts often escalate significantly, sometimes involving inappropriate disclosure of private information to people who have no legitimate reason to be involved. Sometimes involving attempts to recruit children into adult conflicts in ways that would previously have felt off-limits, even to someone with otherwise poor boundaries. Sometimes involving contacting employers, extended family members, or even casual acquaintances with information or accusations designed to damage the target's standing across an increasingly wide, increasingly inappropriate circle. Renata experienced this directly when Marek began contacting her extended family members, people he'd had only minimal contact with throughout their marriage, sharing details about their divorce and custody situation that were both inaccurate and clearly designed to damage her reputation within her own family network, something he'd never attempted during the marriage itself, even during its most difficult periods. This escalation into inappropriate third-party involvement is genuinely significant because it reveals a willingness to cross boundaries that previously held, extending the conflict into spaces and relationships that have nothing legitimately to do with the actual situation, purely to maximize damage or maintain some sense of control that's been lost in the primary relationship itself. So here's where we're headed. As we move into the second half of this episode, I'm going to walk you through what these 3 signs actually mean for your safety and decision-making in real, practical terms, because recognizing these patterns matters far less than knowing what to actually do once you've recognized them. I'm going to explain what happened with Renata over the following months, and the specific concrete steps she took once she recognized she was dealing with something genuinely different from the difficult but more predictable behavior she'd navigated throughout her marriage. And I want to close today's half with something crucial: the difference between this darker phase representing a dangerous escalation, requiring real safety precautions, versus situations that might look similar on the surface but actually represent something more manageable. Because I don't want anyone listening to this episode to either dangerously underestimate a genuinely escalating situation or unnecessarily catastrophize a situation that doesn't actually require this level of concern. Stick with me, because the second half of this episode covers the part that matters most for your actual safety and peace of mind. I'm going to walk you through what these 3 signs actually mean for your safety and decision-making in real practical terms, because recognizing these patterns matters far less than knowing what to actually do once you've recognized them. Let's start with the most important practical principle, one that applies regardless of which specific signs you're noticing. When someone's behavior shifts from predictable, if difficult, patterns into something that feels genuinely more volatile, less concerned with consequences, and less contained by the boundaries that previously held, the appropriate response shifts from psychological management toward concrete safety planning. This is a meaningful distinction, and I want to be direct about it. Much of what we've discussed across this entire series has focused on understanding psychology, setting boundaries, and protecting your emotional well-being within relationships that, while difficult, remained within a certain predictable range. The darker phase we're discussing today requires a different category of response, one that prioritizes physical and practical safety alongside emotional well-being, because the reduced predictability and reduced concern for consequences we've described can, in some cases, correlate with genuinely elevated risk. Here's what this looked like in practical terms for Renata, once she recognized she was dealing with something different from the pattern she'd navigated for years during her marriage. She began keeping detailed, dated documentation of every concerning interaction, the inappropriate contact with family members, the contradictory statements during mediation, any communication that felt threatening or unusually hostile. This documentation wasn't about building a case for revenge or vindication. It served a genuinely practical purpose. If the situation continued to escalate, having a clear contemporaneous record would matter significantly for any legal proceedings, custody considerations, or protective measures that might eventually become necessary. She also had an honest, direct conversation with her family law attorney about the specific changes she was noticing, because attorneys who specialize in high-conflict divorce and custody situations are often familiar with exactly this kind of escalation pattern and can provide guidance specific to her jurisdiction and circumstances that goes beyond what any general psychological framework could offer. Renata also took the step of informing her children's school and her own workplace, briefly and professionally, that she was navigating a high-conflict situation involving her ex-husband, without going into excessive detail, simply to ensure that if he did attempt to contact these institutions directly, as he'd already begun doing with extended family, the people involved would have appropriate context and wouldn't be caught off guard by information that was inaccurate or designed to damage her standing. This kind of proactive, practical communication is worth considering seriously if you're navigating a situation with similar escalation patterns, because it removes some of the power inherent in surprise, inappropriate third-party contact, ensuring that the people being contacted already have accurate context rather than only hearing one, potentially distorted, side of the situation first. I want to address something important here about the difference between genuinely dangerous escalation and situations that might look similar on the surface but don't actually require this level of concern, because I don't want this episode to produce unnecessary alarm in situations that don't warrant it, just as I don't want it to produce dangerous underestimation in situations that genuinely do. The key distinguishing factor isn't the presence of difficult, even cruel behavior, which, as we've discussed throughout this series, can certainly occur within the normal range of narcissistic patterns without representing this specific darker escalation. The key factor is the combination of increasing unpredictability, decreasing concern for consequences, and expanding scope of who gets pulled into the conflict. A narcissist who remains predictably, consistently difficult, even cruel, in ways that have stayed relatively consistent over time, is different from someone whose behavior is actively, measurably escalating in intensity, unpredictability, and scope within a compressed time frame. The former requires the kind of boundary setting and emotional protection we've discussed throughout this series. The latter requires the more concrete safety planning we're discussing today. Another important distinguishing marker is whether the person's support network and professional contacts, the people around them who aren't directly involved in the conflict, also notice and validate the shift you're perceiving. Renata's mediator, an experienced, neutral professional, independently noted the concerning narrative fragmentation during their session, which provided important, external validation that what she was perceiving wasn't simply her own heightened anxiety or hypervigilance following a difficult divorce. If people with professional distance and relevant expertise, whether therapists, mediators, attorneys, or even mutual friends without an obvious stake in taking sides, independently notice and express concern about the same shift you're perceiving, that convergence of outside perspective matters significantly for calibrating how seriously to take what you're experiencing. If you're the only person perceiving this shift, and people with reasonable outside perspective genuinely don't see it, that's worth examining honestly too, ideally with a therapist who can help you assess whether anxiety or trauma responses from the earlier relationship might be coloring your current perception in ways that don't accurately reflect the present situation. Let's talk about what actually happened for Renata over the following months, because I think the trajectory offers something genuinely important beyond just the specific safety measures she implemented. The documentation and precautions she put in place didn't prevent Marek's behavior from continuing to be difficult. And in some ways, this is an important, honest thing to acknowledge. Safety planning and appropriate precautions don't necessarily resolve or de-escalate someone else's behavior. What they do is meaningfully protect you and give you concrete tools and records available if the situation continues to develop in concerning directions, while also ensuring you're not navigating the situation purely through hope or reactive improvisation. Over the following year, Marek's behavior did continue to fluctuate, with periods of relative calm followed by renewed episodes of the concerning patterns Renata had identified. During one of these more difficult periods, the documentation she'd maintained became genuinely important in a legal context, providing concrete, dated evidence that supported adjustments to their custody arrangement that better protected her children from being pulled into increasingly inappropriate adult conflict. This is worth naming clearly because it illustrates something important about why this kind of practical, unemotional documentation matters, even when it feels uncomfortable or even paranoid to maintain in the moment. You're not documenting because you're certain something terrible will happen. You're documenting because if a pattern does continue to escalate, having accurate contemporaneous records available meaningfully improves your ability to respond effectively through whatever legal, protective, or practical channels eventually become necessary. I want to close today's episode with something important about how to hold all of this information without either dangerous minimization or unnecessary catastrophizing, because I think this balance matters enormously for how you actually use everything we've discussed today. If you're currently navigating a relationship, whether romantic, familial, or otherwise, with someone showing signs of this darker phase, please take the practical steps seriously. Document concerning interactions, Consult with appropriate professionals like attorneys or therapists who specialize in high conflict situations. Inform relevant institutions proactively when appropriate, and prioritize your physical safety alongside your emotional well-being. These steps are not overreactions. They are appropriate, practical responses to a genuinely elevated pattern of risk, and taking them seriously doesn't require you to be certain something dangerous will definitely happen. It simply means being appropriately prepared for a range of possibilities, rather than assuming the best and finding yourself unprepared if the situation does continue to escalate. At the same time, I want to gently caution against using this episode as a lens through which every difficult, even cruel interaction with a narcissistic person gets reinterpreted as evidence of this specific, more dangerous phase. Most narcissistic behavior, difficult and painful as it genuinely is, remains within the more predictable range we've discussed throughout this entire series, requiring the boundary setting, emotional protection, and psychological understanding we've built up across many episodes, rather than the more urgent, safety-focused response we've discussed today. Learning to distinguish between these two categories accurately, rather than assuming every difficult interaction represents the most severe possible interpretation, matters enormously for your own peace of mind and for making sure your energy and attention go toward the responses that actually match what you're genuinely facing. If you take away one thing from today's episode, let it be this: trust the pattern, not the isolated incident, and seek outside professional validation when you're genuinely uncertain about which category of response a specific situation actually requires. A single difficult conversation, even a genuinely alarming one, doesn't automatically confirm this darker phase has been reached. A sustained escalating pattern across multiple domains, especially one that other reasonable outside observers also recognize, deserves to be taken with the full seriousness and practical precaution it warrants. Picture this, one final time. Somewhere, a woman sits across from an attorney, a folder of carefully dated documentation open on the table between them, not because she's certain of what comes next, but because she's finally fully prepared for whatever does. The folder represents something that took real courage to build. Not paranoia, not overreaction, but clear-eyed, practical preparation built from pattern recognition rather than fear alone. And somewhere else, in a home now fully hers, her children sleep peacefully down the hall, protected not by hope alone, but by every careful, unglamorous step she took once she recognized that the situation in front of her had genuinely changed shape, and that recognizing it honestly, without minimizing it, and without spiraling into unnecessary panic, was the single most important thing she could do for all of them. The light in that house stays low and steady through the night, the kind of quiet that comes not from certainty about tomorrow, but from having finally fully done everything within her power to meet whatever tomorrow actually brings.